right.
Okay, shall we begin?
Sure, let's do it.
Welcome back to the annual Academic Advising Conference hosted by Metropolitan Community College in Omaha, Nebraska, USA. We are continuing with the theme on change, community, and connection. And this session is entitled Breakthrough Trauma Freeze, a trauma-informed advising approach. And we'll introduce our featured presenter in just a moment. Here are a couple of items for you to note. We encourage participants to engage with us during the conference by tweeting at MCC using hashtag MCCADVCON2021. So the ADV is advising, CON is conference. So let me give it to you one more time. MCC or hashtag MCC ADVCON2021. And the other thing to note, this session is being recorded and questions will be answered at the end of the session. Now on to our featured presenter, KP Patrick. KP Patrick joined the first year experience team as an academic advisor in January 2020. They have been working in advising and student success since 2014. KP received their master's degree in Student Affairs Administration from Michigan State University in 2016 and moved to Omaha, Nebraska, USA shortly after. Since their arrival, KP has served on retention and success committees, specifically working with underserved populations and LGBTQ plus youth. Welcome, KP.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Hans. So like I said, I'm KP Patrick. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm an FYE academic advisor or a success navigator, and I currently work at Metropolitan Community College. And so we're going to talk a little bit about breaking through trauma freeze, a trauma-informed advising approach. So our objectives for today, if my mouse keeps working, is that we're going to potentially review the developmental model, but then also learn about the 5 trauma-informed principles of care. So I want to caution that we are working in collaboration with your advising and counseling services, your advocacy services, but if we continue to work with individuals who have had trauma, you're almost creating a network. And so you can learn about these 5 principles and then inform them into your advising practice. So we're going to do a little bit of self-reflection, but we're going to learn a little bit about developmental advising. We're going to learn about trauma-informed principles, and then we're going to reflect on how to integrate those into our practice as we're transitioning back to whatever advising on your campus may look like in the year of 2021 or 2020 part 2, if you're like, I just want to redo this year. So I think for me, I want to frame this in a way where we're all in the stage of recovering from 2020. Humans are wicked adaptable, and that we process a lot of change and then we adapt to it. So we've been adapting for about a year and a half with our advising principles and things like that. And we've changed and we pivoted, and humans are wicked adaptable, like I said. So we may have gotten used to this new normal, but now we're switching again and pivoting again and maybe opening up our campuses. But that means our students are also doing that too. So we've experienced this collective trauma together and had rapid changes for the first 18 months. And we pivoted and we changed and we readjusted. And that means our students have pivoted and changed and readjusted. But also in terms of safety, gathering in groups might not have been a thing for ourselves and or students. And so that might reinforce some isolating behaviors, which sometimes compound symptoms of trauma and things like that. So again, I found that this picture really kind of spoke to me in a way when I think about how I'm kind of like interacting with my students, because about 80% of all learners have sometimes experienced a traumatic event, and that was pre-pandemic 2020, right? So we're carrying our past trauma, but then we have the pandemic, we might get bad news, we might have stress, and then maybe a minor inconvenience. So think about when interacting with something with higher ed. So for example, one of the things that I've gotten an increased phone calls about is like, I can't really get into my student account. I don't know what's happening. I keep doing the instructions that you followed me. And it almost kind of feels like almost a freak out over something that's a little process. But I think about what kind of things are my students carrying as I'm interacting with them and integrating them into this higher education system. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But I really want to talk also about the principle, and a principle that I use in my professional practice, and something that maybe all advisors or navigators or whatever advising staff is on this call is a developmental advising approach. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between transactional advising and developmental advising. So it's really shifting towards the revolving door of maybe being someone that just gets students what they need. Maybe they get in and out of their classes, but it promotes the understanding of the student, but also the understanding of the student's past experiences and how that can be leveraged in their success, or maybe even in their hindrance in higher education. But I think when someone navigates a really traumatic experience, they've learned maybe some coping mechanisms that may be good and bad, but also we get exposed to maybe knowing someone a little more, because developmental advising is creating this relational experience. It's meeting the students where they're at and tailoring their experience. A lot of maybe some common questions that you might ask is like, hey, what are some things that are happening outside of here, because you're advising almost the whole student, and it's based on having conversations and getting to know them deeper. So we're moving away from this transactional transactional of like, all right, get in and get out, I'll get you your classes, here's your schedule, out the door, right? So we're moving away from that and really kind of seeing deeper connections. But then that also means we get to see what our students are potentially carrying with us as well. So I think it's really important that I'm framing this from a developmental advising, that you're forming deep relational relationships, I guess you can say, and that we are not going to just keep being a calendar manager. We're not a revolving door. And especially with the 2020 pandemic, there wasn't a thing like going to campus. So advisors were really taking a lot of the frontline stuff of referring students out to resources, because it wasn't coming into like a student services office or something like that. You had to become even more knowledgeable of the resources and how they worked, because the student was potentially emailing you and calling you. And so you were kind of even more frontline than potentially where you are. Okay. So I'm going to actually present a little Slido, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a chance to interact with the technology, and fingers crossed, hopefully this works. So there's going to be a question on the next slide, but I just want to give you a second to get into the Slido. Just give you 1 minute, and then we're actually going to see live answers on they're anonymous, so they're not going to be attached to you. But you can do this on your phone. You can do this on your computer as well. If you go to slido.com and then type in hashtag 743127, and then you'll be able to interact with the Slido. So when I say, what are things that come to mind when you hear trauma-informed care? And then I'll give you a second, and if I can tell that it's working, and then I'll switch gears, because it's all about switching gears here. Okay, cool. Awesome. I'm seeing some really good word. No word comes to mind. That's okay. Okay. I'm going to give people maybe like 90 more seconds. Okay. Awesome. Having some major themes automatically pop up for me, which is amazing. Cool. I also love that some people are dropping in the chat, seeing some empathy and care. Okay, awesome. I'm going to give it like 30 more seconds, but I think some people are probably like, well, my word's already up there, so that's okay. Perfect. Okay, awesome. Perfect. Okay. So I'm seeing some very common themes, right, that we're talking about compassion and empathy and listening, but also maybe some things that might be happening to us as well. So maybe burnout, maybe some stress from the student and yourself. I also really like this word, trigger aware, or something like that, or maybe we're unsure, and maybe that's why you're coming to that session, right? So this is why I really like I think things have certain terminologies, and we do certain practices that might model this behavior, right? So, but I think I'm loving seeing the compassion and empathy, but I also like that some people are doing some terminology like complex personality, complex PTSD, or past pain, or things like that. So things that are trauma, like past abuse and things like that, but it's also could be, you also have to be aware or know your impact or have some knowledge. So I really love that all these words kind of come to mind, and then we're going to slowly transition to maybe some trauma-based things throughout this presentation too. Okay, so hello. So I think there's a lot of maybe potentially, I heard trigger aware, and so we're going to talk maybe about potential triggers of higher education, right? So I think when we think about students and how there's an unfamiliarity of higher education, but also it may be students that are coming out of a really huge support system. So maybe they have a really great family unit, maybe they have a good community at work, or maybe they're transitioning out of this community of high school, and now they're transitioning into like this new social network, right? And so they have to kind of maybe be vulnerable, which also is sometimes scary, right? But there's also like a lot of unspoken rules in higher education. Did you fill out your application? Have you made an appointment? Did you go to the required orientation session? And it's like, oh, I didn't realize that was happening. Or, hey, could you slow down and maybe explain that to me? Or I'm just going to stay silent because I don't know if I can answer these questions, because we as advisors have a power dynamic of like, well, they're explaining these things to me, like I should know what they're saying, and now I'm kind of lost, but I'm just going to sit here quietly and keep nodding my head, and that kind of stuff, because that's what a good student does. But then there's also systematic factors that push marginalized populations out. So if you went to the speaker earlier this afternoon, we talked a little bit about that. And even with like first generation students, you can think of some examples of like knowing how to fill out the FAFSA and what does it mean to accept a federal financial aid letter, especially for those with socioeconomic status. Financial aid is a huge component of how they're going to go to school, and things like that. And so there's all this expectation that you're going to get used to it, but then we've been adapting and changing this whole entire year, and you're just going to get used to it, right? You're going to get used to coming back on campus and asking for resources there. You're going to get used to going back into classrooms and interacting with group sessions and doing group work and presenting in front of classrooms instead of a Zoom. We're just going to get used to all of these things. But maybe if we're thinking about it quickly, it might be new for our students who have been with us since 2020. So maybe there is an adjustment period, and showing back some grace to even students who have quote unquote figured it out, but they've been going to school virtually for a year. So there's still some very unfamiliar territory when it even means like, how do I even get a parking pass? Because I haven't been to campus in a year, and things like that. And so we're again shifting towards the communication and giving students lots of new information, even though they've been here, right? So let's talk a little bit about mistaking trauma maybe for disengagement. Now, if you went to the presentation of Advising for Student Wellbeing with Julie Langhole and Nate Bach. They go into some systematic things as well. But also, I do have a PDF that has resources and then listing some things as well. So if my lovely Zoom facilitator could drop that in the chat, there's also links to resources that go over like cognitive symptoms of trauma, behavioral symptoms of trauma, physical symptoms of trauma. So I can't really, and also like short-term distances of trauma and long-term distances of trauma. There's lots that we can kind of like go into about it. So maybe what you see commonly is that a student might have difficulty focusing in your advising appointment, or I have a lot of classic students who might go into like they no-show for the first couple of times, and then when they're ready, they're engaging with me, but they've also missed an appointment 3 times. And then when we talk about like risk and risk taking, going to college is a risk, right? So we're going away from being taught in the K through 12 system and things are provided, but now it's our own skin in the game in a way. So it's a risk. So when we talk about like, hey, we should really go full time, and then a student says, well, I'm not really sure if I can handle full-time work. I'm a little nervous about it. Maybe I should just go 3/4 time, and then we add on the class in the quarter. So there's maybe some tentativeness, things like that. But then there's also maybe anxiety about, again, those classroom interactions, like, am I going to be the greatest student? Am I going to be the right student? Trying to model like really positive behavior, but then maybe also readjusting because they have to readjust to the social skills that are needed for higher education. But also maybe some anger or helplessness when there's maybe a minor bump in the road or a major bump in the road. I think when you call a student and they're like, hey, I haven't gotten anything from my financial aid yet, and then you look in their file and they're missing a financial aid document, that's actually maybe a pretty big hurdle, because they're like, well, if it takes this many weeks to process my file, will it be ready by the time school starts, and things like that. So it kind of like really goes into this like vortex of like, okay, is it going to be figured out? But also some of maybe the symptoms that we see is withdrawal and isolation. Maybe when we suggest student groups, students are like, no, but then they're like, but I hear a common phrase of like, well, that student was just totally zoned out in my meeting, so I just ended it, or I wasn't getting anywhere with that student, so I made a follow-up meeting and things like that. So sometimes people are like, well, the student is just disengaged and not into it, but it may be the fact that they're trying to maybe calm themselves down, trying to regulate their emotions, or maybe like they go into freeze mode, which is what I'm talking about. They sometimes freeze and they're like, I'm just going to sit here and keep nodding my head because I think I think I'm in some trouble. So the reason why I'm talking about that is that it's a natural nervous system reaction. So, and I will talk, I don't need to talk about maybe like the hypothalamus and the amygdala, but the fear centers of the brain, right? So it's core to the nervous system. It doesn't matter so much for me, like that the student is activated in my office, and it doesn't make sense to me that the student is activated in my office. It's just that they are. Right. And so, thousands of years ago, when we were defending ourselves against tigers, we had this really great fight or flight response, or even freeze, trauma freeze. So it helped us in that situation. But now we're going back into more modern times where, okay, my advisor just told me that the class isn't available at the time, and now my graduation is going to be pushed back by another quarter, or there's a hold on my account and I can't register for classes. And that stress response may be activated as I'm talking with the students. So the brain knows that there's a danger, but they don't know the time and space of that danger. So it doesn't, so for me, I think people are like, well, I'm just advising them, or they're just kind of stressing out. Well, their brain is telling them that there's a danger, and we have to kind of navigate like rationally, if there's rational stuff, right? If it can be rational, I know there's danger, but my brain doesn't. I can tell myself that there's danger, but my brain might say, yep, there's totally danger here. There's a tiger in the room. And then that's kind of how we calm down that response, or how do we navigate calming down that response. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the 5 principles of informed care. So if you're a little nervous about like, oh my gosh, there's only 5 words, 6 words if we're, or 7 words if we're counting, on that PDF handout. So Jess, if you wanted to drop that again, there's more of statements with trauma informed care of what we can kind of talk about. But then I also maybe want you to kind of like reflect as I'm kind of going through these 5 principles of trauma informed care. So for example, the first principle is obviously safety. So I want you to kind of think about when my student enters my office, are they greeted by front desk staff, or am I the person that's kind of coming out to greet them? Is the student sitting in a waiting room area, or can they just come back to my office? I keep in mind of like how long my students wait in a waiting room or an appointment, or even virtually, like they're waiting in the waiting room. Does the student know where to find me, know where to get that? So what is your students like first contact sort of look like? And is that indicating that you are a safe environment? Is the signs to your office visible? Do students know where their exits are? When you sit in front of the desk, how is your office kind of set up? Is it set up where you can kind of have a conversation, or do you have this big, so for me, for example, I have this big L-shaped desk in my office. And so I keep that really in mind when there's literally a barrier between me and my student, right? And now when we're transitioning back to campus, there might be plexiglass in front of your desk, or you're being greeted with a mask. So that's gonna, I think when we transition back to campus, and whether you have a mask policy or it's just gonna look a little different, how would that indicate for a student of like, is this safe for me? Because right now, unintentionally, it looks like I'm protecting myself from the student when I have plexiglass, but I want to keep the plexiglass up because again, I'm also thinking about my safety as well, and also how I'm exposing a student to the health risks that are still out there with the COVID-19 crisis. And then the third, I know this is circular, but I didn't want to have something be like process. The second principle I'm going to talk about is trust. When you are explaining procedures to a student, does the student trust the information, or does the student understand the procedures? Are you consistently telling them what your boundaries are as a professional? I make it very important that when I do have a texting phone number and a calling phone number, but I make it very clear towards the end of my appointments of like, hey, once upon a time, when I was working in residence life, I used to answer calls from students all the time, right? But now I don't answer calls like past 5:30, and I'll answer them the next day, but know that my hours are typically from 7:30 to 5:30. So if I leave you on red, or if I go straight to voicemail, it's not that I'm ignoring you, it's I'm just working my work hours and maintaining some boundaries around that, because very similar to 2020, your work area might have been you're going from your bedroom to your kitchen table, or you're going from your bedroom to your bedroom, or just a different spot, right? So is a student able to trust the information that you're saying, but when you talk to them about ways of doing things, is that replicated? Is that reliable? Did your processes changed without a department telling you that your processes changed? So for example, we can go back to that computer login example. And we recently updated how our computer login even looks. So a student might send me a screenshot being like, hey, I know I'm following your directions, but the screen looks a little different. Am I still in the right way? And that might kind of shake up the little bit of trust, right? And then we're going to move on to the third principle, which is all about choice and control. So especially when students have experienced trauma, a lot of their choice and control about the situation, it's maybe a big major event, took away that choice and control. So when I'm advising with students, it's really important that they're also given choice and control when it comes to, it could be something simple like picking out their schedule, what time are their classes out. That's giving them choice and control. But to do the decisions that you make with a student, is the student kind of driving this conversation? Or are we getting caught up in maybe the script or procedural things like, oh yeah, it's really important that you take math and English within your first quarter, or math and English within your first semester. So is that kind of taking choice and control? How can we maybe potentially rephrase those questions where a student feels that they're in control of their advising appointment? I get very nervous when students are like, well, you're the expert, so I'm gonna trust you and you get to make those choices for me. And then I kind of also disclose a little bit about my personal story in advising. Is I did that once and then I added an extra semester onto my graduation because that the advisor knew everything. But for me, I kind of rephrased it and was like, hey, like, what's different about high school is you can choose when you have your classes and you can choose when you want to take classes. So I really even let them know, like, hey, if you don't agree with something I'm suggesting, you can just be like, no, that's okay, I don't want to do that semester, or something like that. So think about how a student might feel like they have choices. Are they empowered? Are they empowered to make a decision? Is it okay if they make the decision? Really validating that it's okay to potentially disagree with what I'm giving, because again, we hold that power dynamic, right? And even the power dynamic might be in a room, like that desk across the room or something like that. We hold the power dynamic, but then when we're advising students, it's really more about their choice. And then I might give some anecdotal stuff. So for example, a student really loves stacking their schedule, but I might be like, hey, all of your tests and assignments are going to be due on the same day. So how do you feel about that if there was a test or assignment due on the same day? Remember, some anxiety about deadlines, and they'll be like, oh, maybe I should break that up. But then I talk about like, okay, well, let's talk about your work schedule and the minimum amount of hours that you have to week. So really empowering the student to be like, okay, I have control of how many hours I work. I have control of how much time I'm in the classroom. But then there's this but there's still this unknown factor of like, how long will it take me to do work, and maybe some coaching around that as well. And then that kind of leads into this fourth principle, is that we're building a relationship of collaborativeness, that it's really not just more about me telling you what the student does or me telling you when your schedules is or when things are kind of due by. We collaborate together and make informed decisions. So for example, does your campus have student advisory boards? How are students able to give you feedback about your advising sessions? Do you solicit feedback from your advising session, and how students are feeling? So I think it's more that it's feeding into that control and choice, but also this collaboration model that you get student input, and that it's not just you and the student talking and then kind of like concluding, but they're able to develop goals together with you, rather than like, here's the goal that I have for you, but let's talk about the goals that we can develop together and work together. So it's more of a collaboration rather than like, all right, I'll see you in 2 weeks. Make sure you get that placement testing done. It might be, hey, I'm going to send you a suggestion of how you write that email, but can you email me back or confirm your dates with me, or just call me and tell me your experience about getting that, interacting with that office. Again, more collaborative. And then also that feeds into empowerment, the fifth principle of trauma informed care. Are the students' strengths recognized, right? So I want to use an example of maybe something that we've experienced, right? When there's an increase in refugee status students, and how they navigate American higher education. So I was working with the student and I was like, hey, like, how are you feeling about this English class? And they're like, well, I'm just a little nervous because I get, back in my country, like, you're not supposed to like talking and solicit feedback from the instructor. So I feel like I'm always like doing something wrong. But then I talk about like, hey, like, you have also been interacting with US education for about a year and you have completed X amount of credits at this GPA. It sounds like you're really great at adapting to new situations. And I'm glad that you're able to kind of recognize that, hey, like, this is a cultural difference. So how do I navigate that? So do you want to talk through some problem solving with that? And so it's really more about like, when we think of trauma, it's like, oh, what's going to hold back the student? What's going to be a barrier? And then, but maybe if we do a strength-based approach rather than a deficit approach, we're empowering the student to be like, yeah, those are some strengths that I have. It's something that happened to me. It's not something that's wrong with me, right? And so really trying to put strengths at the forefront, and then they're able to kind of be like, yeah, I have navigated things like this before, whether it's a cultural landscape, whether it's moving to a new town or trying out a new major, and things like that. So those are, again, in the handout, there's more definitions of the 5 principles of care, but if you also go down to, there's trauma-informed practices of secondary education, and there's also like a questionnaire that you can kind of like self-reflect with as well. So I want to reference that handout again, because again, there's so much I can talk about this with these 5 core principles, but I also only have 30 minutes. So we can kind of keep going from there. Okay. Next. So I'm going to talk a little bit about overlapping practices. So if you want to take out a sheet of paper and kind of like think about, okay, I have this trauma-informed approach, but I also do a little bit of developmental advising, or even you can scratch that out and say my advising style, right? So we're going to talk just a little bit, but you can also work out with this with me as I'm kind of talking, because I am running out of time a little bit. But so developmental advising, one core practice is that we achieve goals through a community and an institution approach. But then also in trauma-informed advising, we see interactions and relationships as a system of support, right? So I want to emphasize again that advisors are not doing this alone, that you have counselors, you have advocacy, you have student behavior and attention, whatever you kind of call it, right? We can view this as a systems approach. That's what I want to get away from, potentially the silos, and that it's not just me, the advisor, but how is my student interacting with financial aid? How is my student interacting with their faculty? How is my student maybe interacting with someone else? Are they involved in clubs? And advising staff has a responsibility to ask about quality. I mean, for example, in Nebraska, we just had a major windstorm that has knocked out power throughout the state, and students may not be getting power until Friday. So are we talking about how they're coming to class even though they don't have internet? If they're coming to class at all, have they missed class? Have they even gotten the chance to talk to their faculty instructors? Do they have food that they can eat? And do I need to connect them to ePantry? Can I have them apply? Can I reference them to get emergency SNAP benefits because of the food that has spoiled in their fridge? So we ask quality of life questions because it influences how we advise the student, how we schedule, how we readjust their goals. And then advising is a collaborative relationship, but also in trauma-informed approach, focusing on a person's strengths and goals. So again, these things tend to overlap, and it's easy to kind of break it down of like, well, okay, I've KP's informed me of these like 5 principles. How can I really work on the principle of collaboration when I'm Zooming with the student? Is it they get to share my screen? Is it they get to tell me how they navigate this part on the website so I can see how they're navigating. And then we kind of work almost together. So again, you can practice this. I can give you a couple moments to think about like, oh, I can see how my advising approach is also trauma informed in this way. And you can drop maybe your reflection in the chat, and I'll give you like, let's say 2 minutes to kind of think about it. I'll just give you a second. So think about how your practices might already overlap with this trauma informed approach, and then you can drop your reflections in the chat. Okay. All right, cool. I'm glad I validated that. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that's a good reflection. Yeah, I think also when, because, you know, there is different offices and things like that. So when I'm saying like, go to financial go to financial aid, it's kind of like this obscure thing, right? So I've taken the time to maybe kind of get to know a little bit about who's working the front desk, or pointing out who their financial aid counselor is, so I can say, hey, your financial aid counselor is Becky. I would really love for you to kind of give her a call and talk about maybe your financial aid package. So I think when we talk about like, go to the advise or go to the learning and tutoring center, sometimes it's really great to maybe refer them to a person as opposed to maybe the sentence. But like, I know it's again, it's helping the student potentially become a little bit familiar with the process, but you can still say like, hey, you can go to financial aid. I know that someone is there from 8 to 5. I know that they also answer questions via this email. It's an obscure email, but I promise that maybe within 48 hours, or you know, you don't have to make promises that you can't keep. I don't want you to, but normally people answer questions within 48 hours on a Monday through Friday or something like that. Cool. Yeah, I'm glad that people are like, yes, I do this practice too. So you may not, again, I want this reflection to kind of be more so of like, I'm already kind of doing maybe some of these trauma informed practices without even kind of realizing it. And so and so thanks, Nicole. Like, you could get to know maybe a potential office, but also like personal reflection. So when I started my position at Metro, I did my 6 weeks of training, and then I was sent home on March 13th. And so I kind of had to build sort of a network kind of virtually, like through this. And so that was very interesting for me when I was like kind of referring students to processes, is that I'd be like, hey, I just want to review this real quick, just so that I, because I think it's interesting because we've also converted to this virtual world as well. And so, but I always say like, hey, if you run into a roadblock, you know, just kind of let me know about it, in that kind of sense. Cool. That is cool. Prior academic when a student. Yeah. So again, really that empowerment, Melissa, like of bridging connections between work and education, especially for, I think for our also like non-trad students, non-traditional above the age of 25. Some of them have been working professionals for longer than I've been a working professional. And so I kind of talk to them about like, hey, like, you know how to manage some of this stuff that you know, if there's a process that's unfamiliar with work, who do you go to? And so it's kind of maybe reframing that in like the academic context. But if anybody else wants to drop like reflections in the chat, go right ahead. But I am gonna move on for the time for time's sake. But thank you so much for kind of reflecting with me. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about working the cortex. So I'm talking about bringing students from this freak out part of their mind to the frontal cortex, the thing that kind of helps you make or calms you down or helps you make sort of some decisions. So and again, like you do. Again, these are just suggestions. If you're like, okay, I kind of know how to like maybe potentially calm a student, these are just suggestions. But I very intentionally set up my office to have different forms of artwork and things like that. So when I see, you know, sometimes you can physically see it. You can see a student, their shoulders are hunched. And sometimes I point that out. I'm like, even on the phone, I'm like, hey, are you holding your breath? Because I haven't heard you breathe. And sometimes it's just like pointing out maybe just the physical behavior, like, hey, I noticed you're holding your breath. I haven't seen you breathe in a little bit. So why don't we just take a deep breath together? And then, or sometimes when they're in my office, this hasn't been something that happens. I'm like, hey, I have lots of art around my walls. Why don't you pick out your favorite art piece and tell me why it's your favorite art piece? And so again, it's kind of moving that nerve in the back of the neck. It's kind of getting them out of this like headspace. And that's kind of why the count to 10 or doing a small change in subject or a small break. Like we have water fountains out in my office. Sometimes I send students, I'm like, hey, come take a 2-minute break, take a walk for a second, and then, or go to the bathroom, wash your hands just for a second, just to get that movement out. Or I kind of, when I was on the phone with the student, I'm like, hey, do you feel all this stress? I want you to send that stress down to your feet. It sounds really hippy dippy, but I'm like, let's send that stress down to your feet and it's going out onto the floor. Let's just take a second to do that. Again, we want advising to be a resource, not a source of stress. So if a student is a little activated in your session, you can be like, hey, you can point out maybe some behaviors of like, hey, I've noticed you haven't taken a breath. I know that, like, let's take a breath together. Okay, this situation has popped up and we're going to work through it together. Just take one more breath with me as I'm looking something up. Count to 10, take a drink of water, something like that. So again, it's talking about maybe just working that prefrontal cortex and then moving it into the frontal cortex and making sure that a student is like coming almost like back to their body in a sense. So it could be something simple of like, hey, just like stomp your feet on the ground for me and like shake out your hands a little bit. Just to kind of like, again, kind of evaporate some stress, maybe doing some breathing. But again, it's making sure that when a student is a little activated, because all of us kind of break bad news in some way and we're kind of like waiting for that reaction. So I think, again, if you want to look up some grounding techniques, but one thing I do is I have students kind of look in my office, or I say, hey, are you in your room? Can you tell me about like your favorite object in the room? And it's just kind of shifting away from that moment of stress and bringing them back into like, oh, okay, I have to kind of interact a little bit with that. And then, but also, it's not going to say like, just because, you know, the student was really stressed out in your office, I think it's still ethically, especially if you don't have a counseling background, it's requiring a collaboration with counselors, right? So sometimes I may be like, hey, like I noticed that when we're trying to make decisions, we get a little on edge. And so I'm like, so is there someone that you're kind of regularly talking to about your decisions? Who's your network of support? And some students are very transparent with me. They're like, yeah, I talk to a therapist. We see each other, you know, once per week. And I'm like, okay, cool. I'm really glad you're talking to somebody, but is there any other other things that I can refer you to, we do have an advocacy. So it's still potentially you're doing a referral, but this also creates a culture of help seeking in social networks. It doesn't have to be just me, the advisor. It could be potentially Danny or Christine Sada or your DSS counselor or something like that. So it creates a network of help seeking and of help seeking. It's rebuilding their social network that they might have left, whether they're coming from high school or it's just their family support. They may be the first person in their family to go to college. So when it comes to like getting what college is all about, you have to kind of create a network. And especially with individuals with trauma, creating a strong social support network is super, super important because it reinforces that someone's checking in on them. It's reinforcing that they can ask for help. But even in after a TENS movement, you can always take a break and ask the student to come back. I habitually reserve an hour on my calendar to just call and check in on a student about a conversation that we had, or I make a follow-up maybe for like next Monday if we're doing a Thursday appointment. And I always kind of release the student. This is a statement that I said that I say all the time when I find students are like, I can't make a decision today. And I'm like, we don't have to make a decision today, and I won't be mad if you don't. Because I think, again, it's coming to that power dynamic of like, I'm going to disappoint them, or they probably think I'm an idiot. And so I don't want them to reinforce maybe what some of the messages that trauma has given them, which is it was my fault, because we tend to internalize or blame ourselves for some things when really it might be like a systematic thing. But it's really, so I don't want to reinforce those messages. That they're like, well, I'm just dumb. And then I'm like, no, it's just, we're not making a decision today. And we do a follow-up, and then maybe I talk to them in a better space. Right. So I think for me, again, you still cast the net, you still make sure that you can do a referral. And things like that. And again, I'm not the only person that's going to present about this. I know that you could potentially talk to a counselor when working with a student who you notice gets activated every time we talk about changing a major. So it's not, again, I want to make sure that you're also talking to your counseling offices, but this is just maybe a starting point, because a system of care and culture is a system, right? It's not just an individual office. So, and with that, I am ending right on time, and we can open it up for discussions or some questions. Again, here's some more resources, but again, in that PDF document, that Canva document that I have created, there is also some more intense PDF, especially the creating trauma-informed care practices in post-secondary higher ed. But that's all I have for right now. Thank you.
KP, while we're waiting for questions, I'll just share that PDF on the screen for anyone who didn't get to see it or wants to look at it still. So
cool, thanks. And they're all hyperlinked, so it's all free downloads too, because access is important. Great. All right, any questions, any more reflections? I can be excitable all day. No problem.
EP, the very first comment that I saw in the very beginning said such important reminders for us to what's behind the scenes of the behaviors we observe. So I appreciate that being mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's just, again, we see like fractions of what our students are. So like I think again, it's some of the counseling practices that I have, but it's a system of non-judgment, right? But it's very hard to be like, okay, you were 15 minutes late to my appointment, and now I'm gonna have to reshift my whole entire calendar. So I really like when the speaker was like get out your first thought and then keep on continuing with the student. I think that I was like, yes, reinforce stuff that I'm talking about in my presentation. But
Did you see Sarah's note, taking notes and about to go trauma-informed advise?
cool. And again, like, I think it's cool if you still collaborate with your offices and things like that. Again, trauma-informed approaches don't require, I'm not asking you to go get a counseling degree. I'm asking you to maybe have some awareness around some of those things. You still have to refer to counselors. I think it's important. And that kind of stuff. So, but again, it's creating awareness and then creating that culture of system and help. Thank you so much.
And then there was Lynn's comment. Thank you for the presentation. The students I meet often say yes when they mean no. So I recommend with let me think about it. I like the idea that decisions take time and research.
Yeah, cool. That's a great suggestion. I love that. Yeah, I love when people are like, oh my gosh, you have such a decorated office. And I'm like, yeah, that's intentional. Thank you, Gloriela. Yeah, and also like, thank you for pointing out that there's some hands-on tips, but also those grounding techniques can also be for you, and that kind of stuff. So I think, because again, I was a habitual, like, hey, I'm going to take a 15-minute walk after an advising appointment if my calendar allows that. But sometimes I might tell the front desk of like, hey, I just got to walk for 10 minutes and I'll be back. Because I think, you know, we can sometimes have some countertransference or some the secondary trauma. Thank you. Yeah. And so it's kind of, again, taking care. I know it's like taking care of yourselves, but again, I think if you practice grounding techniques or some form of even meditation or thinking like that or just even a point of self-reflection of like, how am I feeling after I've interacted with that student? And it's not creating the student the problem. It's just like, okay, let's drop in and kind of see how we're feeling. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm a fidgeter as well. I'm surprised I didn't pull out my pen throughout the whole entire presentation. So cool.
KP, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Throughout your conversation, especially when you talked about safety and de-stressing, I've had students come in tears over, they don't even know what it's over. But
right.
my front of my office is glass, and then I have glass in my door, and I'm thinking, how uncomfortable is that? You know? So I'm wondering, should I put paper up there? Should it probably needs to be more private, is my comment.
Yeah, I think that's it's kind of interesting with like modernized buildings, right? They're like, we need glass windows so everything's open. But so, and again, I wasn't in my office long enough to even think about that, and I've like been noticing it. I'm like, where's the chair in my office? So sometimes I might say with a student of like, hey, you can sit on the side of my desk so that no one can see what you're talking. But it might also be like, have a conversation with your facilities, because in my office there was like in one of my former offices there was like one window and someone could like peek in and then like the student would notice, because I don't like authoritative offices. I keep my offices really open. And so, but then I like put like googly eye tapes over it, and it like instantly relieves some of the stress of my students. So I think it's, again, what's also really interesting is you can probably put up flyers that your campus is posting, and it's like, oh, look at all these resources in front of my office. And then, but I know that some people have asked to like install blinds and things like that just for the privacy of the student, and that kind of stuff. Because again, when a student's coming in, you're like, I'm just going to deal with the intensity of the student. I'm not really sure who's watching. Yeah. But yeah, I think it's interesting when we keep that in mind of like, hey, when can we do some privacy of the student? Or even if you have an office, do you even have an office to have students meet with you? And that kind of stuff.
We're still good for 5 minutes, but I do notice Nicole's question. Ferial Pearson mentioned talking with students about legislative issues. Do you think this can trigger trauma too?
Again, I think, so trauma sometimes compounds itself, right? And so again, think about maybe the core principles is especially, and again, we can talk, trigger warning. I'm going to talk a little bit about DACA. DACA was probably the most stressful, and whether DACA was still going to be around was probably the most stressful year and a half as an advisor with my life, because I'm trying to build like educational plans, but like a student's like, I don't know if I'm going to be there. And I was like, do you want to tell me more about that? And then they're like, well, because it's also disclosure of like your undocumented status. And so I think it's also disclosures can be triggering as well. So I think it's, again, legislative issues, I think will always trigger students because that's informing their lives. But some students don't even want to talk about it, or they're not even aware of the news and that kind of stuff. So it's like, so I think I would be kind of like careful of like, hey, like what's going on in your life that might influence your academic behavior, and maybe keeping it general. But then also if a student has disclosed to you, sometimes I say, hey, like I know your DACA renewal is coming up. How's it going? Because an unintentional like fee for folks is that even the renewal is thousands and thousands of dollars. So yeah, but I think you drive it because you're like, I don't want to trigger a student, right? But like the student might already be thinking about it, and it's nice, like Farrell said, it's nice to be like, okay, this person is thinking about it and is thinking about me individually. Yeah. I hope that answers your question, but okay, yeah. Okay.
Any last minute thoughts or questions before we wrap it up?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for listening to me. I know it's not exactly like you're like, ooh, I wonder what this topic is going to be about, but I thank you for listening and continue to reach out to the systems that support students. That's all I have.
All right. Well, thank you, KP. That was definitely valuable. To make sure that all of you look at those resources on the bottom. I have looked at each one of them and I'm very impressed with those from the bottom of the handout. So we are on the home stretch of this conference and appreciate all of you staying engaged with us. Next at 2:15 Central Standard Time, you will not want to miss the presentation entitled Leading in a Post-COVID World, Embracing Change, Connection, and Community. And then the grand finale closing keynote presented by Dr. Melissa Zarin at 3:30 Central Standard Time is entitled As We Return to Normal, Our Mental Health Needs Some TLC. So enjoy a rejuvenating break, and all of you back at 2:15.